Approximately 140 million years ago, during the early Cretaceous period, something truly bizarre was wandering the ancient landscapes of what is now Argentina. And when I say bizarre, I really do mean it, because this creature looked like it had stepped straight out of a heavy metal concert. Meet the Bajadasaurus, quite possibly the most punk rock dinosaur to ever walk the earth. And yes, that's a scientific assessment. Now, when you think of dinosaurs with impressive head and neck ornamentation, your mind probably jumps to the classics. Triceratops with its iconic frill, Stegosaurus with its plated back, maybe even Pachycephalosaurus with its dome head built for ramming. But Bajadasaurus? This guy decided to take things in a completely different direction, literally. You see, while most dinosaurs that evolved defensive spines had them pointing backwards or upwards, Bajadasaurus said no thank you to convention. Instead, it grew a row of elongated spines that projected forward from its neck. Forward, as in pointing toward its own face. And if that mental image isn't strange enough, let me paint you the full picture.
These weren't just little nubs or modest protrusions. We're talking about spines that could reach over half a meter in length. That's nearly 2 feet of bony projection jutting out from each neck vertebra. And they curved elegantly forward and slightly outward, creating what can only be described as the most extreme Mohawk in prehistoric history. So naturally, the question becomes, why on earth would any animal evolve something like this? And honestly, that's where things get really interesting. But before we dive into the theories, let's set the stage for where and when this punk rocker lived. And if I somehow teleported you to early Cretaceous Patagonia right now, your first thought probably wouldn't be that you're standing in the same place that would one day become Argentina, because this region was nothing like the windswept steppes and dramatic mountains we associate with modern Patagonia. Instead, you'd find yourself in a world that felt almost tropical. Warm and humid air would hit you immediately. The temperature would likely hover somewhere in the comfortable mid-20s Celsius, though it could certainly get warmer. Rivers carved through the landscape in winding paths, some broad and lazy, others faster and more vigorous as they descended from higher ground. These waterways fed into lakes and wetlands that dotted the terrain, creating pockets of lush vegetation wherever water was abundant. And speaking of vegetation, the plant life would look both familiar and alien at the same time. Conifer forests dominated much of the landscape, their tall, straight trunks rising high into the air.
But these weren't the pines and firs you might be imagining. Early Cretaceous conifers included Araucarias, the ancestors of modern monkey puzzle trees, as well as various podocarps and other ancient lineages. Beneath them grew thick understories of ferns, some reaching heights that would tower over a human. Cycads were everywhere too, their palm-like fronds and stout trunks giving certain areas an almost prehistoric beach resort vibe. And mixed among all of this were ginkgos and horsetails and 1,000 other plants that would make any time-traveling botanist lose their mind with excitement. Now, here's the thing about all this vegetation. Where there's abundant plant life, there are herbivores, lots of them. And early Cretaceous Patagonia was absolutely crawling with plant eaters of all shapes and sizes. This was the golden age of the sauropods, those iconic long-necked giants that have captured human imagination ever since we first started digging up their bones. And Bajadasaurus was one of them. You see, Bajadasaurus belonged to a very specific family of sauropods known as the Cretaceous. And this family was, shall we say, the rebels of the sauropod world. To understand what made them special, you first need to understand what typical sauropods were doing at this time. Most sauropod lineages had embraced one evolutionary strategy above all others: get big, really big, impossibly big. We're talking about animals that could exceed 100 feet in length and weigh as much as 70 tons or more. The Titanosaurs, which would later dominate the southern continents, were already evolving toward their massive sizes. The Diplodocids, while past their peak diversity, still included some genuine giants. And the Brachiosaurids were strutting around with their ridiculously long front legs and even more ridiculously long necks. Gigantism was the name of the game, and most sauropods were playing it hard. But the Dicraeosaurids, they looked at this arms race toward enormity and said, that's not for us. Instead of growing larger, they stayed relatively compact. And I say relatively because even a small sauropod was still the size of a large elephant or bigger.
bigger. Bajadasaurus itself measured around 9 to 10 meters in length, or roughly 30 feet from nose to tail tip, which sounds impressive until you realize that's basically the economy class of the sauropod world. Some of its contemporaries were 3, 4, even 5 times that length. But what the Dicraeosaurids lacked in size, they more than made up for in style. Because while other sauropods were busy growing longer necks to reach higher vegetation, the Dicraeosaurids decided to accessorize. And accessorize they did. The neural spines on their vertebrae, which are the bony projections that stick up from each bone of the spine, began to elongate it over millions of years of evolution. In most animals, these spines are relatively modest, providing attachment points for muscles and ligaments. But in the Dicraeosaurids, they became something else entirely. In some genera, like Amargasaurus, another South American genus, these spines formed paired rows running down the neck like a double mohawk, 2 parallel lines of elongated projections that would have made the animal unmistakable from any angle. Scientists have debated whether these spines supported a sail-like membrane or stood alone as naked spines, and honestly, we still don't know for certain. But either way, Amargasaurus looked like nothing else. And then there's Dicraeosaurus itself, the namesake of the family, which lived in Africa and had its own impressive set of forked neural spines. Not quite as extreme as Amargasaurus, but still distinctly unusual.
But Bajadasaurus? This guy cranked things up to 11. Its spines weren't just long, they weren't just paired, they curved dramatically forward in a way we've never seen in any other dinosaur, living or extinct. While Amargasaurus and Dicraeosaurus had spines that pointed mostly upward or slightly backward, Bajadasaurus's spines bent forward over its own neck. Picture it like this. If Amargasaurus had a mohawk, Bajadasaurus had a mohawk that someone had styled to sweep forward, defying gravity and common sense alike. The spines arose from the neural arches of the cervical vertebrae and then curved in a graceful arc toward the front of the animal. From the side, they would have created an incredible silhouette, like some kind of armored beast ready to impale anything that got too close to its head. And this brings us back to that burning question that anyone looking at this animal asks. Why? What possible evolutionary advantage could forward-pointing neck spines provide? It seems so counterintuitive. Wouldn't backward-pointing spines make more sense for defense? Wouldn't upward-pointing spines provide more visibility for display? Why would any animal evolve bony projections that curve toward its own face? Well, paleontologists have proposed several hypotheses, and each one is more fascinating than the last. The first, and perhaps most obvious idea, is defense against predators. And to understand this hypothesis, you need to put yourself in Bajadasaurus's proverbial shoes. You're a medium-sized sauropod living in early Cretaceous Patagonia. You're not the biggest herbivore around, not by a long shot. You don't have the raw mass that would make predators think twice about attacking. You can't simply be too big to fail like your titanic cousins, which means you're potentially on the menu for the various theropod predators prowling your neighborhood, and there were plenty of them. Early Cretaceous South America was home to multiple lineages of meat-eating dinosaurs. Abelisaurids were present, those stocky, powerful predators with their characteristically shortened faces and tiny arms that made T-Rex look long-limbed by comparison. Carcharodontosaurids were evolving toward the massive sizes they would achieve later in the Cretaceous, and even the smaller individuals were formidable hunters. And various smaller theropods filled out the predator guild, opportunistic carnivores that would happily take down young or weakened sauropods if given the chance. So what do you do if you're Bajadasaurus? You make yourself as difficult to eat as possible. And where do predators typically attack when taking down large prey? The neck. It's where the vital blood vessels are. It's how you suffocate and immobilize your victim. A bite to the neck can sever the carotid arteries, crush the trachea, or damage the spinal cord. One good grip on the neck and the fight is essentially over. Every big cat on the modern African savanna knows this, and presumably Cretaceous theropods knew it too. So those forward-pointing spines would have created a formidable barrier for any predator trying to bite down on Bajadasaurus's most vulnerable area.
Imagine being a theropod and lunging for what looks like an easy meal, only to get a face full of bony spikes. Not exactly a pleasant dining experience. The spines would have made it incredibly difficult to get a clean bite on the neck without risking serious facial injury. And unlike backward-pointing spines, which would mainly protect against attacks from behind, forward-facing spines would guard against the most common attack vector, from the front and sides. A predator approaching from the front would see those spines aimed directly at its face. One approaching from the side would still have to contend with them while trying to target the throat or spine. It's actually a pretty clever defensive arrangement when you think about it. However, there's a significant problem with this hypothesis. Those spines, as impressive as they were probably quite fragile. Fossil evidence suggests they were thin-walled and filled with air sacs, a feature common in sauropod vertebrae that helped reduce overall body weight. This pneumaticity, as it's called, was an adaptation that allowed sauropods to grow so large without collapsing under their own mass. Air-filled bones are much lighter than solid ones, while still providing reasonable structural support. But hollow, air-filled spines would not have been particularly strong. A determined predator, especially one with the powerful jaws of an abyssosaurid or carcharodontsaurid, might have simply snapped them off. One crunch, and that impressive mohawk becomes a liability rather than a defense.
Unless, of course, the spines were covered in something that made them tougher. And this leads us to the second major hypothesis: keratin sheaths. You see, many modern animals with horns and spines have bony cores covered in keratin, the same protein that makes up your fingernails, hair, and the outer layer of your skin. This keratin covering can significantly increase the length and sharpness of the underlying bony structure. Think of a rhinoceros horn, which is actually just a massive cone of compacted keratin fibers with no bony core at all. Or consider the horns of cattle and antelopes, which have bony cores but are sheathed in hard keratin that adds length and sharpness. A pronghorn antelope's horn sheaths can be several inches longer than the underlying bone. If Bajadasaurus' spines were similarly covered in keratin, they would have been even longer than the fossils suggest. Those half-meter bony cores might have supported keratin sheaths that extended another 10 or 20 centimeters, turning them into truly formidable weapons. And keratin, while not as hard as bone, is tougher and more flexible. It might have made the spines resistant to breaking while also giving them sharper points. Additionally, some researchers have suggested the spines might have been covered in a combination of keratin and skin, creating a sail-like membrane similar to what has been proposed for other dinosaurs. Spinosaurus, with its famous back sail, likely had skin stretching between its elongated neural spines. Could Bajadasaurus have had something similar on its neck? A sail of skin connecting those forward-pointing spines would have created an even more dramatic display and might have served functions beyond defense. Thermoregulation, for instance. A sail filled with blood vessels could have helped the animal warm up quickly in the morning by absorbing solar radiation, or cool down by radiating excess heat. But honestly, we just don't know for certain. Soft tissues like keratin and skin rarely fossilize, leaving us to speculate based on skeletal evidence alone. The only definitive thing we can say is that Bajadasaurus had elongated, forward-pointing bony spines. Everything else is educated guesswork.
This suggests Bajadasaurus occupied a specific ecological niche. It wasn't competing directly with the massive sauropods that could strip entire trees or sweep up ground cover. Instead, it was probably targeting particular types of vegetation at specific heights. And here's where the relatively short neck becomes relevant again. Most sauropods evolved long necks to reach high vegetation, accessing food sources that other herbivores couldn't touch. The longer your neck, the higher you could browse and the less competition you'd face. But Dicraeosaurids went the other direction. Their necks were relatively short for sauropods, which meant they were feeding at lower levels. Bajadasaurus was probably browsing on vegetation at or below head height, targeting ferns and cycads and low-growing conifers rather than reaching up into the high canopy. This actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. If your neck is covered in elaborate spines, Holding it vertically to reach high branches might be awkward and energetically expensive. But if you're feeding at lower levels, keeping your neck more horizontal, those spines become much more practical. They'd be positioned perfectly to deter predators while you're in the vulnerable feeding posture. It's an interesting example of how different traits can interact with each other. The elaborate spines might have constrained neck posture, which in turn influenced feeding ecology. Or maybe it was the other way around, the low browsing lifestyle coming first and the spines evolving to protect a naturally horizontal neck. Either way, the whole package fits together. And this brings up a broader point about the Dicraeosauridae as a whole. These dinosaurs represent an alternative evolutionary strategy within the sauropod family. While most sauropods embraced gigantism as their primary survival strategy, the Dicraeosaurids stayed relatively small and invested in elaborate ornamentation instead. It's like they were playing a completely different game than their relatives. And for millions of years, it worked beautifully. Dicraeosaurid fossils have been found across South America, Africa, and possibly North America, suggesting they were a successful and widespread group. They coexisted with their giant relatives and carved out their own niches in Mesozoic ecosystems. They proved that you didn't need to be the biggest to survive. You just needed to find your own way. But, like all good things, the punk rock sauropods eventually faded from the scene. The Dicraeosauridae disappear from the fossil record by the late Cretaceous. The last confirmed members of the family are known from the early to mid-Cretaceous, and then nothing. We don't know exactly why they went extinct. Perhaps they were outcompeted by other herbivores as dinosaur faunas continued to shift and change. The early Cretaceous was a time of transition, with many older dinosaur groups declining and newer ones rising to prominence. Perhaps climate changes altered the vegetation communities they depended on, making their specialized feeding strategy less viable. Or perhaps the rise of new predator groups made their defensive adaptations obsolete, the evolutionary arms race moving past what spiny necks could counter. We may never know for certain. The fossil record is incomplete, and extinction is often a gradual process, with multiple contributing factors rather than a single cause. But what we do know is that for millions of years, these strange spiny sauropods walked the Earth. And among them, Bajadasaurus stands out as perhaps the strangest of all, a dinosaur with a forward-pointing mohawk, a punk rocker in a world of giants.
Now, let me tell you a bit more about the discovery of this magnificent weirdo. Bajadasaurus was described scientifically in 2019, making it a relatively recent addition to the dinosaur family tree. The fossils were discovered in the Bajada Colorada Formation in Huaycan Province, Argentina, one of the most productive dinosaur-bearing rock units in South America. This formation has yielded numerous important finds over the years, giving us a window into early Cretaceous ecosystems of the southern continents. The team that described Bajadasaurus included several prominent Argentine paleontologists, continuing a proud tradition of South American scientists documenting their continent's rich prehistoric heritage. Argentina has been at the forefront of sauropod research for decades, and discoveries like Bajadasaurus are a testament to the skill and dedication of researchers working there. And when the description was published, it immediately captured public attention. How could it not? Those forward-pointing spines are so unusual, so visually striking, that Bajadasaurus was guaranteed to become a media sensation. Artists rushed to create reconstructions. News outlets picked up the story. Social media was flooded with images of the punk rock dinosaur. For a brief moment, a small, spiny sauropod from Argentina became one of the most talked about prehistoric animals in the world. And honestly, that's wonderful, because paleontology thrives on public interest. Every child who sees a reconstruction of Bajadasaurus and thinks that's the coolest thing ever is a potential future scientist. Every adult who reads about this strange dinosaur and feels a sense of wonder is engaging with the deep history of life on Earth. These discoveries connect us to our planet's past in ways that few other things can. Before I wrap up, let me touch on one more aspect of Bajadasaurus that often gets overlooked: its name, Bajadasaurus Pronuspinax. Scientific names are usually in Latin or Latinized Greek, and they typically describe something about the animal or honor someone or someplace significant.
In this case, the genus name Bajadasaurus simply means lizard from Bajada, referring to the Bajada Colorado formation where it was found. Pretty straightforward. But the species name, Pronuspinax, is where it gets fun. It comes from Latin pronus, meaning bent forward or inclined, and Greek spinax, meaning spine. So Pronuspinax essentially means forward-bending spine, or forward-leaning spine, which is just about the most accurate and on-the-nose scientific name you could possibly give to an animal whose defining feature is literally having forward-pointing spines. Sometimes paleontologists get creative with their naming, using obscure references or inside jokes, or honoring colleagues and family members. Sometimes they go for dramatic flair or cultural references, and sometimes they just describe exactly what they're looking at. Bajadasaurus pronuspinax falls firmly in that last category. It's a forward-spined dinosaur from Bajada, Colorado. Simple, accurate, honest. And honestly, kind of perfect.
Because at the end of the day, that's what makes this animal special. Those spines, that mohawk, that completely inexplicable decision by evolution to make a dinosaur that looks like it should be headlining a rock concert. We may never know exactly why Bajadasaurus evolved its signature look. The evidence simply isn't there to definitively settle the debate between defense and display and thermoregulation and whatever other functions those spines might have served. We may never find a complete skeleton that answers all our questions about how this animal moved and lived and interacted with its environment. The fossil record gives us what it gives us, and sometimes that's just tantalizing fragments rather than complete pictures. But we know Bajadasaurus existed. We know it walked the Earth for millions of years as a successful component of early Cretaceous ecosystems. We know that evolution, in its infinite creativity, decided that forward-pointing neck spines were a viable strategy worth pursuing. And we know that somewhere in ancient Patagonia, herds of these small, spiny sauropods browsed on ferns and cycads, their punk rock profiles silhouetted against prehistoric skies. They lived and died and left their bones for us to find 140 million years later. And now we get to wonder at how strange and wonderful life can be. That's the real gift that fossils give us. Not just facts and data and evolutionary reconstructions, but wonder. A sense of connection to the vast sweep of Earth's history. Evidence that our planet has been home to creatures beyond our wildest imagination for billions of years. And if that doesn't make you appreciate the sheer weirdness and beauty of life on Earth, I don't know what will. So the next time someone tells you dinosaurs were boring, the next time someone says they were just big dumb reptiles doing big dumb reptile things, tell them about Bajadasaurus. Tell them about the dinosaur with a punk rock mohawk. Tell them about forward-pointing neck spines that make no obvious sense until you start thinking about predator defense and sexual selection and the wonderful strangeness of evolution, and watch their minds get absolutely blown. Because that's what dinosaurs do. They blow our minds. They remind us that reality is stranger than fiction. They show us that the history of life is an endless parade of wild experiments and bizarre solutions and creatures that seem too weird to be real. Bajadasaurus is just one of millions of species that have called Earth home over the past 4 billion years, and every single one of them has a story worth telling. Thanks for watching, and until next time.